Imagine waking before dawn in the frozen silence of Siberia. Your breath turns to ice in the air, your boots are stiff from yesterday's snow, and the sound of a guard's whistle means it's time to leave the thin blanket behind. In this remote prison camp, there are no second chances, only endless days of labor, bitter cold, and a fight to survive until tomorrow. Tonight, we'll step quietly into the shadowy world of the Soviet Gulag, not through headlines or politics, but through the eyes of those who lived it, day after day. When a prisoner's train journey ended at a remote Siberian station, the first thing they noticed was the silence. A silence so deep that even the clatter of boots on frozen ground seemed swallowed by the endless snow. For some, this was the first glimpse of the vast, desolate wilderness that would be their world for years. They had traveled in cramped cattle cars, often for weeks, with little food, no bedding, and a small hole cut into the floor for sanitation. The air inside had been heavy with the smell of unwashed bodies and damp clothing, and the rattling of the train wheels had become a kind of dull heartbeat in their ears. Upon arrival, there was no grand building, no towering prison wall, only a few low wooden barracks, a watchtower or two, and miles of open land. Guards with rifles stood ready, their fur-lined hats pulled low against the cold. Prisoners quickly learned that walls were unnecessary here. The landscape itself was the prison. The nearest village might be 50 miles away, across frozen rivers and thick forests with temperatures that could drop below 40-degree F. The intake process was brisk and unsentimental. Names were called, numbers recorded, and any remaining personal belongings were taken away. Prisoners were issued rough cotton uniforms and thin wool coats, hardly enough to protect against the Siberian winter. Those who had arrived with decent boots were lucky. Others were given worn shoes that would let in snow and ice. Before being led to the barracks, new arrivals would often be given a first task, carrying heavy loads of firewood or supplies. This was partly to move needed goods, but also to test endurance. The work began immediately, as if to remind them that their old life had truly ended the moment the train doors slid open. Inside the barracks, the living quarters were crude. Long wooden bunks, each wide enough for 2 or 3 men to share, stacked in tiers. A single iron stove stood in the center, but the heat rarely reached the far corners. The air smelled of damp wood, coal smoke, and unwashed wool. Lice were common, and prisoners quickly learned the daily ritual of inspecting seams and collars before bed. At night, the sound of the wind against the walls made the camp feel even more remote. Some prisoners lay awake, listening to the crack of trees splitting in the cold, wondering how many winters they would endure before returning home, if they ever did. Others whispered to bunkmates about their former lives, speaking softly so as not to disturb the fragile silence. For new arrivals, the first night was often the hardest. The shock of the cold, the strangeness of the surroundings, and the realization that escape was nearly impossible settled in all at once. The guards made their rounds, boots crunching on the snow outside, rifles slung over their shoulders. Inside, prisoners tried to sleep beneath thin blankets, their bodies curled tight to keep in what little warmth they had. By dawn, the camp would already be stirring. The day's labor awaited: logging, mining, road construction, each task demanding strength, endurance, and the will to keep moving in the face of exhaustion. But for now, in that first long night, prisoners lay in their bunks and listened to the wind, their breath curling into pale clouds in the dim light. The train slowed with a groan. its iron wheels grinding against the frozen rails. Outside, nothing moved except the wind. Endless stretches of white tundra swallowed the horizon. The guards shouted for the prisoners to stand, their voices sharp in the frigid air seeping through the cracks in the carriage walls. After days, sometimes weeks, of travel in cramped, filthy cattle cars, the prisoners had reached their new reality, the remote labor camp that would be their world for years to come. The moment the doors creaked open, the Arctic wind cut through every layer of clothing, numbing skin within seconds. Prisoners stumbled down from the train, legs weak from confinement. The snow crunched beneath their worn boots, but many were in shoes far too thin for this climate. Some were nothing more than rags tied around their feet. The guards barked orders, prodding them toward the camp gates. The camp loomed ahead, rows of low wooden barracks surrounded by high fences, topped with barbed wire. Watchtowers rose at each corner, their silhouettes dark against the pale sky. Inside the towers, armed guards scanned the new arrivals, rifles at the ready. Smoke from the mess hall chimney curled into the air, but the smell offered no comfort. Those who had been here long knew the food inside would be meager at best. As they marched toward the gate, the prisoners passed a sign with bold letters. Labor in the USSR is a matter of honor, glory, valor, and heroism. It was a cruel mockery, for everyone knew the truth. This was not a place of honor, but of punishment and survival. At the gate, guards separated the men from the women. Personal belongings were confiscated, a photograph of a child, a worn scarf from home, a small book tucked into a coat pocket. These items vanished into a guard's bag, never to be returned. New arrivals were given numbers to replace their names. From that moment forward, the Gulag would not see them as people, only as labor units. Inside, the barracks smelled of damp wood and unwashed bodies. Wooden bunks were stacked 3 levels high, each space barely large enough for one person to turn over. Mattresses were stuffed with straw, often crawling with lice. A thin blanket was the only protection against the freezing nights, when temperatures could drop below 40 degrees C. The camp commander made his presence known with a cold, rehearsed speech. His voice was flat as he explained the rules. Work from dawn until dusk, no disobedience, no escape attempts. Punishments were swift and severe: solitary confinement in an unheated cell, reduced rations, or worse. Then he dismissed them with a single line: your survival depends on your work. That night, the new prisoners lay awake in the dark, listening to the muffled coughs, the rustle of straw, and the low murmur of those already resigned to their fate. Some clung to memories of home. Others forced themselves not to think at all. In the Gulag, hope was both a lifeline and a dangerous luxury. Tomorrow, the real labor would begin. The dawn had hardly broken over the frozen treetops when the prisoners were already being organized into work brigades. There was no gentle easing into the day. The guards moved quickly, checking names from the roll call, ensuring no one had slipped away during the night. The assignments for the day were posted, though posted might be too formal a term. More often, a guard simply barked orders, and men trudged toward their fate. Labor in the Gulag was not just about keeping prisoners busy, it was about breaking them. The Soviets believed in corrective labor as a tool for reform, but in reality, it was a system designed to push human endurance past its limits. The nature of the work varied depending on the location of the camp. In the far north, many were sent to chop timber, not the gentle work of shaping planks, but the brutal task of felling massive conifers in temperatures that froze eyelashes together. Others were sent to the mines. Gold, coal, and other precious minerals were extracted by men wearing little more than thin coats and rag-wrapped hands. In summer, swarms of mosquitoes tormented them. In winter, the cold made metal tools stick to skin like glue. Still others labored on massive construction projects, railways, roads, or even entire towns being built in the middle of nowhere. Prisoners shoveled gravel, mixed concrete, or carried heavy timbers. The conditions were primitive, no protective equipment, no machinery to ease the burden. What made the work truly grueling was the quota system. Each man had a daily output requirement. So many cubic meters of earth to move, so many logs to cut, so many tons of rock to haul. These quotas were intentionally set almost beyond reach. Failure to meet them could mean reduced food rations, a punishment that all but guaranteed a downward spiral toward illness and death. Despite this, there were moments of grim camaraderie among the prisoners. A quiet understanding developed between those who had been there the longest, work together, share the load when possible, and watch out for each other when the guards' eyes were turned. The Gulag was built to isolate, but survival often depended on small acts of cooperation. Sometimes, amid the sound of axes biting into wood or the metallic clang of pickaxes, there was the faint murmur of conversation, whispered exchanges of news from home, rumors about political changes, or even dark humor. These small human connections made the day's brutal hours a little more bearable. But make no mistake, labor in the Gulag was relentless. It consumed the daylight hours entirely, leaving prisoners exhausted, frostbitten, and aching. For many, there was no sense of progress, no completion of a project to take pride in. It was simply one day's work followed by another, and another, until weeks, months, and years blurred together. By late afternoon, the light would begin to fade, especially in the northern camps, where winter days were painfully short. The brigades would line up once again, tools in hand, trudging back to the camp under the watchful eyes of armed guards. The day's labor was over, but survival in the Gulag was not measured in completed tasks. It was measured in simply making it through to the next sunrise. The day in a Soviet Gulag began long before the sun even thought of rising. At 5:00 a.m., a loud metallic clang from a guard's baton against the iron bars jolted prisoners from their thin, lice-ridden mattresses. There was no gentle wake-up call, only a barked order, "Podyom," "Get up." That echoed through the barracks. In winter, the cold was so bitter that prisoners often woke to find frost crystals on their blankets and the air visible with every breath. The water in the wooden pails inside the barracks might already be frozen solid. Many woke still hungry from the night before, a dull, gnawing emptiness in their stomachs that never truly went away. The first order of the day was roll call. Prisoners shuffled into the yard, lining up in the freezing dark while guards counted heads. Missing prisoners were rare, but when they did occur, often due to escape attempts, the punishment could delay work for hours, with prisoners forced to stand still in sub-zero winds until the situation was resolved. Breakfast came next, though it could hardly be called that. A tin mug of watery kasha, or thin soup, sometimes with a piece of coarse black bread, was all the fuel they would get before a full day of exhausting labor. Those with connections or bribes might secure an extra spoonful, but most would only gulp down their meager ration and prepare for what was ahead. Work assignments were brutal and varied depending on the camp's purpose. In the far north, many prisoners worked in logging camps, felling massive trees in the freezing forests. Others mined coal or gold, dug ditches, or constructed railroads. The work was not just physically punishing, it was deliberately designed to break the human spirit. Supervisors, often other prisoners elevated to positions of authority, were known to be harsher than the guards themselves. A sick or exhausted prisoner was rarely excused from work. Illness often meant death. A man with a fever or frostbite still had to march to the job site, shovel in hand. Falling behind quota could result in reduced rations, a punishment almost worse than a beating. The workday could last up to 14 hours, and there was no weekend. In summer, the endless daylight of the Arctic meant work continued without pause. In winter, the short hours of sun meant trudging to and from labor sites in complete darkness. Lunchtime, if it could be called that, came hours into the day. Workers received another ladle of thin soup, often little more than hot water flavored with cabbage or fish, eaten in the open air. There were no tables, no chairs, no warmth, only the hope that the brief rest might keep them on their feet until nightfall. Evenings offered no relief. After the march back to camp, prisoners endured another head count, another bowl of watery gruel, and sometimes mandatory political re-education, lectures or propaganda sessions meant to instill Soviet loyalty. Most listened in silence, too exhausted to care, while dreaming of bread, warmth, or home. When they finally returned to their bunks, muscles aching, hands blistered, and stomachs growling, they knew that the next day would be exactly the same, and the day after that, and the day after that, and the day after that, for years, if not decades. The monotony was as crushing as the labor itself, and for many, it was this endless repetition that slowly eroded their will to survive. The sun barely rose in the northern sky, yet the prisoners of the Gulag were already deep into their daily work. In the harsh world of the labor camp, work was not simply a duty, it was a punishment, a tool of control, and, for many, a slow form of execution. Every prisoner understood that failing to meet the impossible quotas could lead to punishment, reduced rations, or worse. In many camps, work assignments varied depending on the location and purpose of the facility. Some prisoners were sent into the dense Siberian forests, tasked with felling massive trees with little more than dull, rusted saws and chipped axes. Each swing of the axe felt like it drained a drop of life from their bodies, yet the quota demanded thousands of kilograms of timber per day, a number few could realistically meet. Others were sent to the mines, where the air was thick with coal dust, and every breath felt like inhaling sandpaper. In the bitter winters, the tunnels were dark, damp, and freezing. In the summers, suffocating heat made breathing almost unbearable. Prisoners in road and railway construction camps faced a different form of hell. They worked on endless stretches of land, hacking through frozen earth or laying heavy rails by hand. There was no machinery to ease the burden. Every stone was lifted by human hands, every beam carried on weary shoulders. In permafrost zones, prisoners sometimes lit fires on the ground to thaw it, only to shovel away mud in knee-deep sludge. Food was the one incentive dangled before them. Work harder, and you might get a bigger piece of bread. But in reality, the system was cruelly designed. As prisoners grew weaker from malnutrition, their work output fell, and their rations were cut further. It was a downward spiral few escaped. Supervisors, often armed guards or fellow inmates granted small privileges, pushed workers mercilessly. Even if a prisoner collapsed from exhaustion, the work did not stop. They were kicked, shouted at, sometimes beaten with rifle butts until they rose again, or left to die where they fell. The endless labor did more than break the body, it crushed the spirit. Conversations during work were discouraged or outright forbidden. The only sounds were the swing of tools, the rumble of carts, and the occasional crack of a guard's voice or whip. And yet, in this environment of suffering, tiny sparks of humanity sometimes survived. Prisoners occasionally formed quiet partnerships, one cutting wood while the other rested for a moment, then switching roles. Some sang under their breath, a half-forgotten folk song from a home they might never see again. These small rebellions of the soul kept a flicker of life burning, even as the Gulag tried to extinguish it. If the Gulag was a crucible, it was one that tested not only the body, but the mind. The bitter cold, meager rations, and grueling work schedules ensured that mere strength alone couldn't guarantee survival. What kept a prisoner alive wasn't just muscle. It was strategy. Those who adapted, learned the unspoken rules, and understood the complex web of prisoner hierarchy had a better chance of seeing the next spring. In the barracks, whispers of how to survive were often shared in coded language. These weren't written down, such things could never be trusted to paper. Instead, survival tips passed from mouth to ear like secret currency. One of the most important strategies was learning to preserve energy. New arrivals often tried to prove their strength on the work site, hauling more timber than the next man, swinging their pickaxes with force. But veterans knew this was a mistake. Overexertion would burn precious calories, and in the Gulag, calories were life. Seasoned prisoners worked in a rhythm, slow, steady, conserving breath, always doing just enough to avoid punishment. Another tactic was forming alliances. In a place where theft was rampant and food was scarce, having someone watch your back was critical. Friendships in the Gulag weren't built on trust in the normal sense. They were calculated partnerships. Two men could take turns watching over each other's bread ration, guard against thieves, or share scraps of clothing to endure the nights. Then, there was the dark reality of trading with criminals. The Gulag was often divided into two major groups: politicals, those accused of crimes against the state, and criminals, hardened repeat offenders. The criminals had their own internal codes, control over contraband, and access to stolen food. To survive, many political prisoners had to negotiate with them, offering small favors, labor, or services in exchange for a slice of bread or a pair of boots. Equally important was protecting one's health. In an environment where sickness could mean a death sentence, prisoners used every scrap of ingenuity to stay alive. Some stuffed paper or rags into their boots to keep frostbite at bay. Others found ways to lose themselves in the infirmary for a few days, feigning illness or exaggerating symptoms, if it meant avoiding work in deadly storms. But this too was dangerous. Malingering could lead to punishment, and the infirmary wasn't always safer than the work site. mental survival was another hidden battle. The cold could crush bones, but despair could crush the will. Prisoners developed mental routines, reciting poetry, replaying old conversations, imagining meals from the past, or mentally walking through the streets of their hometowns. Anything to keep the mind anchored to the idea that life existed beyond the fences. For some, small acts of rebellion gave meaning to their struggle. Hiding tools, delaying work by a few delaying minutes, or sabotaging equipment, these tiny gestures, invisible to most, reminded them they still had agency. Even in a world where everything was taken, they could still choose to resist in subtle ways. But perhaps the most universal survival strategy was hoarding, not just food, but anything that could be traded. A button, a nail, a scrap of wire, a piece of string. In a place where official supplies were scarce, these small treasures could mean the difference between warmth and frostbite, between hunger and a slightly fuller stomach. For the newcomers, the Gulag was a lesson in adaptation. Some learned fast and adjusted their behavior to fit the unspoken rules. Others clung to old habits, unable to accept this new reality. And many of them didn't survive their first winter. The ones who did had mastered not just the art of endurance, but the silent, calculated strategies that kept their bodies and spirits alive. In the end, survival in the Gulag wasn't about winning. It was about lasting one more day, one more week, one more season, until, by luck, chance, or political change, the gates finally opened. In the harsh world of the Soviet Gulag, survival depended not only on enduring the brutal climate and exhausting labor, but also on navigating the camp's rigid system of punishments and discipline. Rules were not just guidelines here. They were weapons of control, and breaking them, even unintentionally, could result in severe consequences. Whether you were a hardened criminal or an innocent political prisoner, discipline in the Gulag was an ever-present shadow. A system built on fear, the Gulag authorities maintained control through a combination of strict regulations and an atmosphere of constant surveillance. Guards, camp administrators, and even fellow prisoners acted as eyes and ears for the state. The smallest infraction, such as speaking out of turn, failing to meet a labor quota, or possessing unauthorized items, could trigger a swift and merciless punishment. The camp operated under the NKVD's strict disciplinary codes, which were often intentionally vague. This gave guards enormous power to interpret rules in whatever way suited them. Many infractions weren't about actual wrongdoing. They were about asserting dominance and reminding prisoners of their powerlessness. Common infractions, punishable offenses, ranged from the obvious to the absurd: work-related, not meeting your work norm, appearing tired on the job, or talking while working. Behavioral: speaking disrespectfully to a guard, failing to stand at attention, or showing signs of poor morale. Possession: keeping extra bread, hiding warm clothing, or holding onto personal letters not approved by censors. Political: whispering about the outside world, criticizing the Soviet system, or even joking about Stalin. In reality, many prisoners faced punishment simply because the guards needed to make an example of someone. Forms of punishment. Life in the Gulag was already grueling, but punishment could push the human body and mind to the breaking point. Isolation cell, shizo. The most dreaded punishment was solitary confinement. Prisoners were locked in freezing, pitch-black cells, often with no bedding and barely enough food to survive. Sentences could last days or weeks. The cold seeped into the bones, and the silence could drive a person to madness. reduced rations since food was already scarce. Cutting rations was a cruel but effective way to enforce obedience. A punishment ration might be as little as 300 grams of bread a day, just enough to keep a person alive, but too little to maintain strength for hard labor. Beatings and public humiliation guards often used physical punishment, beating prisoners with rifle butts, whips, or even bare hands. Sometimes, punishments were carried out in front of the entire work brigade to send a message. Work in the penal brigade, those deemed troublemakers could be assigned to the penal work brigade, forced into the most dangerous and exhausting jobs, such as hauling logs, mining in freezing water, or building infrastructure without proper tools. Few survived long under these conditions. Collective punishment, perhaps the most psychologically devastating tactic, was punishing everyone for one person's mistake. If a single prisoner tried to escape, failed to complete their quota, or was caught with contraband, the entire work brigade might lose their evening meal. This turned prisoners against each other, fostering distrust and resentment. It was an intentional strategy. Divide the prisoners so they could never unite against their captors. The role of informant's punishment was not always handed down by guards directly. Sometimes it came from fellow prisoners, acting as informants. These snitches were often recruited with promises of better food, lighter work, or early release. This bred a climate of paranoia. A whispered complaint or a private joke could be reported and twisted into a serious offense. Some informants acted out of fear, others out of self-interest, but their presence made it impossible for prisoners to fully trust one another. Psychological control. The Gulag's punishments weren't just about physical suffering, they were about breaking the human spirit. Prisoners quickly learned that nothing they had was truly theirs. Not their time, not their possessions, not even their thoughts. This mental pressure was as effective as any whip or isolation cell. The uncertainty of when punishment might strike kept prisoners in a constant state of tension. Some learned to speak as little as possible, move only when told, and blend into the background, becoming invisible in the hope of avoiding notice. The rare acts of defiance despite the risks, there were moments of quiet resistance. Some prisoners risked punishment to share food with a weaker comrade. Others carved tiny messages into wood or stone, documenting their suffering in ways they hoped might one day be found. A few even confronted their punishers, knowing it could mean death, simply to assert that they had not been entirely broken. These small acts, though often punished severely, were sparks of humanity in a system designed to extinguish it. Legacy of Gulag discipline for those who survived. The memory of Gulag punishments lingered for the rest of their lives. Many former prisoners spoke of the fear, not of the cold or hunger, but of the ever-present threat of sudden, arbitrary punishment. The randomness of it, the lack of any way to protect oneself, was what left the deepest scars. In the Gulag, discipline was not about order or justice, it was about control, and it worked, not because prisoners respected the rules, but because they knew there was no escape from them. Despite the ever-present hardship, the Gulag was not entirely devoid of small, fleeting moments of humanity. Like flickers of candlelight in a vast, cold darkness, these moments sustained prisoners, reminding them of their shared humanity even in the face of overwhelming brutality. In the midst of endless toil, there were days when a fellow prisoner might quietly pass a piece of bread into your hands, bread they could scarcely afford to give away. In that gesture was an unspoken bond, a reminder that survival wasn't always just about one's own endurance, but about helping the person beside you make it through another night. Winter evenings in the barracks could bring strange kinds of companionship. Men and women, huddled in their respective corners, sometimes found themselves sharing stories of hometowns left behind, of children they had not seen in years, of rivers and forests that now existed only in memory. The camp became a tapestry of recollections stitched together from different corners of the Soviet Union. The sound of spring floods in Ukraine, the sharp scent of pine in Siberia, the crowded city streets of Leningrad. In such moments, for a few precious minutes, the frozen walls around them seemed to melt. There were also moments of unexpected humor, born not from joy, but from a stubborn refusal to surrender entirely to despair. A prisoner might crack a quiet joke about the camp's watery soup, drawing a few muffled chuckles. Another might imitate the pompous walk of a particularly disliked guard, causing stifled laughter that warmed the listeners like a hidden fire. These moments carried risk. Laughter could be misinterpreted as defiance, but for many, it was worth it. Even in a place designed to erase individuality, acts of creativity found a way to surface. Some prisoners, once artists or musicians, would sketch faces in the margins of scraps of paper. Others would hum fragments of old folk songs, soft enough that the sound was barely audible, yet enough to remind those nearby that art still existed. When a rare musical instrument appeared, perhaps a smuggled harmonica, its sound would ripple through the barracks like sunlight breaking through clouds. There were moments of compassion between unlikely companions. Political prisoners might share advice with hardened criminals on how to protect themselves from frostbite. Experienced thieves might share tips with academics on how to barter for better work assignments. The rigid boundaries between different prisoner groups sometimes softened, replaced by a mutual understanding that everyone, no matter their background, was bound by the same struggle. One of the most profound forms of humanity came in the form of shared silence. In the early hours, when frost still coated the inside of the barrack walls and the air hung heavy with breath, two prisoners might simply sit beside each other without speaking. No words were needed. The quiet company itself was a comfort. Some prisoners found solace in tending to the sick, despite the risk. A stolen potato or a sip of warm water could mean the difference between life and death for someone lying weak with fever. Those who offered such kindness knew they might never receive repayment, yet they gave nonetheless. In the unforgiving arithmetic of the Gulag, such gestures were irrational, and perhaps that's what made them so deeply human. Occasionally, holidays would bring a fragile sense of celebration. A prisoner might carve a tiny wooden star to mark the new year, or someone might whisper the words of a religious prayer on Christmas Eve. Even those who had long abandoned faith sometimes found themselves moved by such moments, feeling for a brief instant that the outside world still existed, waiting beyond the barbed wire. The Gulag could strip away almost everything: possessions, freedom, even identity, but it could not entirely erase the human capacity for kindness, for connection, for the stubborn spark that refuses to go out. These moments of humanity, though small and scattered, were like hidden jewels buried beneath the snow, unseen by guards or officials, yet shining brightly in the hearts of those who experienced them. For many, these were the memories they carried beyond the camp, reminders that even in the harshest conditions, the human spirit could still reach out to another and say, wordlessly, "I see you, I care." we are still alive. For many prisoners, the dream of leaving the Gulag was a distant light, flickering faintly on the horizon. And yet, every so often, someone would be called to the commandant's office, their name read aloud in a tone as cold as the Siberian wind. That name might be followed by a single word that changed everything: released. Freedom, however, was rarely the clean break they had imagined during those endless nights in the barracks. The bureaucratic release, the first step toward freedom, was almost always paperwork, pages of official forms, stamps, and signatures. The Soviet bureaucracy was meticulous, even when it came to letting people go. Some prisoners were released because their sentence had ended. Others were granted early freedom due to political shifts, mass amnesties, or a re-evaluation of their case. A released prisoner might be handed a spravka, a small official slip of paper confirming their liberation. It was both a ticket to the outside world and a constant reminder of their status. For political prisoners, it often contained restrictions. They couldn't live within a certain distance of major cities, couldn't hold certain jobs, and sometimes were required to report to the police regularly. The long walk away, leaving the camp itself, could be surreal. One day, you were behind barbed wire. The next, you were standing outside the gates, staring at endless wilderness. Many camps were in remote locations, and there was no welcoming committee, no bus stop, no friendly town nearby. Some prisoners walked for days or even weeks to reach a train station. They carried little more than a bundle of clothes, a small ration of food, and the hope that the world beyond had not forgotten them. Reuniting with family, or not reunion, was a dream that sustained many during their imprisonment. But reality was often bittersweet. Years or decades might have passed since they had last seen their loved ones. Children had grown up without them. Spouses had remarried, or entire families had been relocated by the state. Some prisoners discovered that their release brought suspicion, not celebration. Neighbors avoided them. Old friends were wary. In the Soviet Union, being a former Gulag inmate marked you for life. Many were branded as enemies of the people, even after they were technically free. The struggle to rebuild a life finding work was one of the hardest challenges. The spravka often carried the stigma of imprisonment, and employers were reluctant to hire anyone with a prison record, especially political prisoners. Those who had been sent to the Gulag for so-called counter-revolutionary crimes faced even more barriers. Some had to settle for the harsh irony of working in the very same regions where they had once been prisoners, living in settlements near former camps. Others became itinerant laborers, moving from place to place in search of acceptance. Lingering trauma. Even when their bodies were free, many former prisoners remained trapped by the mental and emotional scars of the Gulag. Years of deprivation, cold, and fear left deep wounds. Nightmares of forced labor, hunger, and punishment haunted their sleep. Sudden loud noises could send them back in memory to the camp's guard towers. Some coped by staying quiet, avoiding political discussions, and blending into the background. Others, particularly writers and intellectuals, eventually shared their stories, though doing so often came at personal risk. Those who never fully left a strange truth emerged for some. Life in the Gulag, as brutal as it was, had provided structure. In the camps, every hour was accounted for, every decision made by someone else. Freedom, with its endless choices, could be overwhelming. Some former prisoners even chose to return to the areas near their old camps, not as inmates, but as civilians, living in the shadows of the barbed wire. Where they had once labored, the hope for rehabilitation. In later decades, especially after Stalin's death in 1953, the Soviet government began to acknowledge, though never fully atone for, some of its injustices. Many former prisoners were rehabilitated, meaning the state officially admitted they had been wrongfully convicted. These rehabilitations often came too late to repair the lost years, but they provided a measure of dignity for the survivors and their families. Life after the Gulag for those who managed to rebuild their lives. Small pleasures took on enormous meaning. A warm room in winter, a family dinner, the ability to walk down the street without a guard's command. Yet the Gulag's shadow lingered. It was not just a place, but an experience that shaped an entire generation. The stories of release were often quieter than the stories of suffering, but they were no less important. They spoke of resilience, adaptation, and the enduring human need to seek life, even after the harshest winters. The Gulag system officially came to an end in the mid-20th century, but its shadow has never truly vanished. For those who survived, the scars, both physical and emotional, remained as constant reminders of years stolen. For the Soviet Union itself, the Gulag became a dark chapter in its history, one that would influence politics, culture, and memory for generations. For survivors, release often brought an initial rush of relief, only to be followed by the realization that they were stepping into a world that had moved on without them. Families had been broken apart. Children had grown up without knowing their parents. Friends and neighbors were often hesitant to associate with former prisoners, fearing guilt by association. Even in freedom, a lingering stigma clung to those branded as enemies of the people. Yet, for many, telling their stories became a way to reclaim agency over their past. Memoirs such as Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago brought the grim reality of the camps to the world stage. The accounts were harrowing, men and women describing starvation, cold, and brutal labor, but also moments of courage, resilience, and quiet defiance. Through these narratives, survivors challenged the Soviet propaganda that had long downplayed or denied the existence of such camps. Historians now view the Gulag not as an isolated phenomenon, but as an integral part of the Soviet political system. It was both a mechanism of repression and a tool of economic exploitation. Entire industries, forestry, mining, railway construction, relied on the forced labor of prisoners. The Soviet leadership saw the Gulag as a means of both punishing dissent and fueling rapid industrial growth. In Russia today, the memory of the Gulag remains contested. Some view it as a necessary evil during a time of national struggle, while others condemn it as one of the most grievous violations of human rights in the 20th century. Memorials and museums, such as the Perm 36 Labor Camp Museum, seek to preserve the truth of what happened. At the same time, some voices in modern political discourse attempt to minimize or reinterpret the Gulag's role, reflecting broader debates about history and national identity. The legacy of the Gulag also reaches far beyond Russia's borders. The very word Gulag has entered the global vocabulary as a synonym for brutal prison camps and state oppression. In countries around the world, it is invoked as a warning about what can happen when unchecked power and authoritarianism go hand in hand. For descendants of survivors, the Gulag is often a deeply personal history. Some grow up with only whispers about what happened, while others inherit letters, diaries, or oral histories that paint a vivid, often painful, picture. This intergenerational memory has helped keep the truth alive, ensuring that the world does not forget. Perhaps the most enduring reflection on the Gulag is the resilience of the human spirit. Even in the harshest conditions imaginable, where winter winds could strip the skin, where hunger gnawed endlessly, where hope was a dangerous luxury, people found ways to retain a sense of dignity. A secret poem, a smuggled letter, a shared crust of bread, these small acts became lifelines. In reflecting on the Gulag's legacy, one truth stands out: remembering is not enough. Understanding how such a system came to exist, and how ordinary people were swept into its machinery, is essential to preventing history from repeating itself. The Gulag serves as a stark reminder of the fragility of freedom and the need for vigilance in protecting human rights. As the last generation of survivors passes away, their voices echo through their testimonies, books, and the monuments that stand in former campgrounds. The silence that once surrounded the Gulag has been broken, but the responsibility of preserving its lessons now falls to us. It is a legacy built on suffering, survival, and the unyielding human will to endure, and it must never be forgotten.